Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Precision Dairy Farming from Hooves to Harvest webinar series. This project is brought to you by the UVM Extension Northwest Crops and Soils team and is sponsored by the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. We have a great lineup of speakers joining us over the next 2 weeks from all over the country, internationally, and also some local experts. And we will be digging into a variety of topics, exploring technologies available to dairy producers. We have started the series last week, hearing about some of the more cow-side technologies and tools, and are moving into exploring tools and technologies used in feeding management and also field work. You can use the same Zoom link that was provided to you when you registered to access all of the sessions. And if you have missed any of our sessions, they have been recorded and posted to the Northwest Crops and Soils program website under the Conference and Events tab. There are water quality and certified crop advisor credits available for each session, and we will share the link and QR code at the end of the session. There will also be 3 poll questions throughout the presentation. So if you could take a second to answer them when they pop up on your screen, we would appreciate it. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the chat and we will facilitate them when the speaker has concluded. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Damian Goldring. He is calling from Tel Aviv, Israel. He serves as the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer of Consumer Physics. He is in charge of product development and previously was in charge of research and development. His vast experience in product, projects, research and development, and management, including as director and project manager at Tessera. He holds more than 30 patents and has written numerous scientific, peer-reviewed, and published papers. Damian has a PhD in electronic engineering from Tel Aviv University. Thanks so much, Damian, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amber. Great. So it's a pleasure being here today, and thank you very much for hosting me and us as a company. And thanks for the introduction. So today we're going to focus on our products, or specifically a product called SCIO Cup that can be valuable in managing feed, especially in dairy farms. Just a very quick intro of our company. So our company is Consumer Physics, but everyone knows as a SCIO, we provide solutions to analyze materials in real time, basically generating data that can help people to better manage their processes or make decisions, especially in the ag world, in the food industry. That's basically what we do. And today we're going to talk about one vertical that we serve, which is the dairy farms and how we can help dairy farms. So I have a set of slides, basically, that I will use to, guide you through all the information. But just before we start, I want to share with you a video. It's about 3 minutes long, but I think it gives the essence of what I want to convey to you today. And then I'll talk in more details about what's in this video. So bear with me as I share my screen here. All right, so it's a 3 minutes video, or 2.5 minutes, and then we'll go forward from there. Right. So I hope that was useful, and we'll move now to the actual slides. So, as you can understand, we're here to talk about feeding in the dairy farm and how can the SCIO cup be a useful tool to improve the operation within the day-to-day operation in the farm. So let's start with, and again, I'm sure most of you guys already know this, but just let's state the obvious in the sense that why would dairy farmers want to track their feed? So feed is obviously the largest single cost item for dairy farms. And we all know that cows also need feed consistency. It's not just important to feed what is needed, but it's also very important, even more important to my understanding, is that the feed consistency is maintained for high efficiency of milk production. Finally, out of all the feed ingredients you may have, the forage is probably the one that changes the most. It's probably one of the biggest component of the overall ration. So the dry matter especially will vary quite a lot, or potentially will vary quite a lot throughout the year, either because the way the harvest was, or the way the bunker is piled up, or even because of rain events or other weather events that may happen. So in order to make sure that we optimize this, I think one of the major things that needs to be done is to basically track forage dry matter and then adjust the rations accordingly. Because at the end of the day, the feed is based on the dry matter. And if the moisture level of the forage changes, that should change the adjust, or that potentially you need to adjust the rations to account for this. And if you do that, then I think that's been proven quite a few times with different research, and people working on this, showing that it will lead to optimization of feed efficiency and reduce the refusals. So again, this is not something that, I'm not an expert in feeding by any way, but we've been around in this market to know that a lot of nutritionists and people from academia and people from farms basically adopted the fact that, if you track for dry matter, adjust your rations accordingly, you will optimize the feed efficiency. And this is where we come in. Up until this type of equipment showed in, then the way to track dry matter was basically to use some sort of a method to dry down the forage. So you weigh it, and then you dry it down, then you weigh after you're drying down, and you get the moisture level and you calculate dry matter, right? But that's labor intensive, that's lengthy, that doesn't allow you to really test quite a lot, because there's a lot of effort associated with that. And what basically we came up with is a near infrared spectroscopy based tool that is fast, is easy to use, is portable, is accurate. It's basically a different way of doing this, but with a much easier process. It has other advantages that we'll discuss later on in this presentation. We use the SCIO cup to analyze many types of materials, not even just related to dairy farms, but specifically here we do forage. We enable dry matter analysis of different types of forages, high moisture corn, soybeans, and more. And I'll discuss this in a minute about different types of materials that we can cover that may be relevant for a dairy farm. So again, even this slide doesn't really cover everything that we do, but just to give you an idea. So we have a forage package where we cover all kind of different types of forages. And from obviously the most important one would be corn silage and legume silage, but then we have a long list of different types of silage that are being used, including green chop. So corn silage can be either fermented or ensiled, such as being fed throughout the year, and it could be freshly chopped green chop corn that's just been harvested in the field. So this is one type we do. And Another type or another package that I believe is or may be relevant to some of the farms is what we call the grain package. And today we provide 4 different types of grains that can be analyzed with, or oil seeds that can be analyzed with our SCIO cup. So it's soybeans, corn, wheat, and barley. Where for corn we currently provide moisture only. That's going to change, by the way, this year, but right now it's just moisture. And then for soybeans we provide moisture, protein, oil, and wheat and barley are both moisture and protein. So I know that for many farms, forage would only be the relevant materials, but some farms do receive or use corn or soybeans, and that may be relevant for these farms. And I included high moisture corn and dry shelled corn as part of the forage package, because this is not real grain, but mostly a mix of broken and powdered kernels. So we usually include this as part of the forage package and not the grain package. Now, a lot of people during the years have asked us about, can we test beyond dry matter for forage? So, for example, protein, fiber, and all kind of variants within, fiber or protein. And the reality is that unlike grains or oil seeds, forage is a much more complicated material. It's very non-homogeneous, has a lot of challenges when it comes to analyzing it, because it has a lot of, volatile materials. And won't go into all the details, but the reality is that it's much more difficult to analyze forage than it is grains. And therefore, when it comes to anything beyond moisture in forage, it becomes very difficult to provide an accurate measure of this with near-infrared spectroscopy. And that's why we simply don't provide this, because we don't want to provide something that's not good enough for our customers. It's definitely possible to analyze it in the lab after you dry it down and grind it. So that's where it becomes much more simple. But otherwise, it's, we can provide a solution, but it's not going to be good enough. And therefore, we just leave it at dry matter. So the video I presented before basically showed how our solution works, but just, to make sure it's clear. So we have the SCIO cup. We need to turn it on. We need to then use our mobile phone app to choose what is the exact material we want to analyze. And then we just choose the right material, where it is corn silage or legume silage or whatever else it is. We fill the cup with the sample and then basically scan either by pressing a button on the cup or on the app, and then receive the result on the mobile phone within about 7 seconds. So the whole process from the time you press scan until you get the result is about 7 seconds. And therefore, even if you fill it up a few times, and you take a few samples, it's a matter of 1-2 minutes until you actually get the result. Some of the other features we have with the cup, besides obviously measuring the materials we already discussed, so you can add notes and share the results instantly. This way you can actually remember if there was something specific about that sample, or if there's anything else you want to track. You can either add a text or add a picture, scan a barcode. You can track locations very easily. We can save the GPS location if that's enabled by the user. And we also allow users to actually define specific locations. It can even be within the farm. So let's say pile number 1, pile number 2, etc., etc. And then once all this data is entered and the scans come in, then we can monitor trends or some abnormal situations that may occur as you go ahead and track the dry matter of the forage. Finally, as the video mentioned, you can scan when you're offline, but you can only get a result, like an analysis result, when you're online. So you can scan offline, and then once you reconnect, you get the result. From a battery standpoint, this is a chargeable device with a USB charger. It will scan even more than 2,000 scans between two consecutive charges. So you should be all set for most of the applications you have. Everything is kept on the cloud and in the app. So you can always go back and see every scan you took, what was the result, when was the scan taken, what kind of notes it had. If the GPS is enabled, you'll be able to see the GPS location or at a predefined location. This is how the screens look like more or less within the app. So you can select where you're going to be scanning and then see the results, based on the dates for a specific location, et cetera, et cetera. Accuracy is important, obviously, and we have been making and we keep on making every effort we can to make our devices as accurate as possible. We basically calibrate or teach our systems how to measure dry matter of forage. We work with different laboratories in the market to validate the performance of our calibrations or models and make sure that they work fine. We use today thousands of samples tested from samples came from all over to make sure, again, that the calibration stand within a certain criteria. And we keep improving this all the time. We know that there's still room for improvement, but today, after a few years of developments, we have a rather good accuracy of the calibrations. You can see the graph here. We actually went from farm to farm, made sure that SCIO cup reads pretty much close to laboratory equipment. Still, there will be cases where you'll see differences. It's not perfect yet, but in the majority of the cases, that will be pretty close to the lab the way it is today. But we intend to introduce improvements even in 2024 and even beyond that. One more thing, if a specific user observes a certain bias, so basically that means that your SCIO cup is always scanning a little bit higher, a little bit lower than what you'd expect, whether it is your preferred laboratory or preferred other method that you're using on the farm, and you want to dial it up or down a little bit, we can provide that service. So we try to avoid this because we believe it's not the best thing to do, but if that's needed, if you contact us, we'll help you dial your SCIO cup to the point where you want it to be. Because that, if there was something that might have been a little bit troubling to some of our customers, that would be it. So again, in most cases, it's not needed, but if you feel it's needed, we can help you with that. There's another aspect of accuracy. Doesn't have to do just with comparing your samples with the lab. At the end of the day, silage or forage is a very non-homogeneous material, as we discussed, and therefore, to really know what you're feeding, you need to average out, as much as you can, because the reality is you're going to be taking much fewer samples than you really are feeding. And therefore, to really represent what is being fed to the animals, you need to scan or take samples as much as you can. So what the SCIO cup really helps you with, beyond actually, reducing the time and make it simple, is to also take more samples and therefore average more and therefore reach a higher accuracy. And therefore, while we know that the laboratory is probably the most accurate way of doing this, there's only that much samples you can actually send to the lab. There's only that much samples you can cook with an oven, but you can scan much more, either per day or the amount of days you're actually going to be using the SCIO cup. And that can help you really get a better idea of what's going on with the dry matter of a certain pile or bunker and so on. So it's beyond just the time it saves, it's also the ability to average more. Best practices. It's important to use the SCIO cup, with a certain practice. Otherwise, it can generate a lot of confusion. So, and the video again mentioned that quite well. One thing is it's important to properly sample the pile, and I think that's being, something I learned when I first went and visited farms was that there is a proper way of taking samples from a pile, and that's taking samples coming from different locations in the pile, et cetera, et cetera. Then you fill it in a bucket and you mix it properly, and then break it down to at least 3 subsamples. Scan each one of the subsamples and then let the application average it out. That's probably the best way to utilize the SCIO cup. Now, few comments. First of all, try to test each silage type at least once a day. Now, I know that's a lot. I imagine most farms don't really test once a day. But if you cannot do it once a day, then do it once a week. Because doing this once a month is just simply not enough. You will not be able to properly represent what you really are feeding, and you won't be able to detect significant changes fast enough to make an action, to take an action, right, of changing the ration or doing something else. So ideally every day, but we understand that's too much, or it can be too much, and therefore once a week, twice a week, that's, in my opinion, the minimum people should do in order to really know what they have or what they're feeding. And then here we recommend taking 3 subsamples. Obviously, if you can take 5, that's better, but at least 3. And finally, if there was a rain event or a snow event, taking a scan shortly after will make sense, because that can influence significantly the level of moisture in forage. SCIO cup has been being used now by by farmers and nutritionists for a few years now. We've been getting a lot of feedback. People find this very useful. I think it helps people to better manage their feed. So overall, we've been very happy with the way it's been accepted in the market. It's not without problems. There's always going to be things to improve, but overall, I think it's been well accepted in the market. I think it's important to mention that there are different types of use cases when you're analyzing forage. I would talk about 2 main use cases. One is on-farm feeding. That's probably the main use case, where cows needs to be fed all the time, every day, and you want to avoid refusals. You want to avoid drop in milk production, and therefore managing your feed, adjusting your rations, it's probably the right thing to do. So that's one use case. That's the most obvious one, I would say. The second one is at harvest. So people want to make sure that they harvest at the right moisture, and therefore using the SCIO cup can help speed up or make more measurements of samples that are in the field, to know when to harvest and to make sure that what you're getting is the right moisture. Maybe you want to dry it down a little bit more. So this is a second use case. We see a lot of pickup when people are using the SCIO cup in September, mostly when corn is being chopped. And I think that's a very important thing to do, to try and monitor as much as possible the corn silage moisture when it's just being harvested. At the end of the day, bottom line is what makes the difference. And I think, we've shown in many different ways, using, ROI calculators and other ways to really, convince ourselves. And we've also seen people from the industry actually convincing themselves that this can actually save money. This can actually boost your bottom line. We estimate this about 25-30 cents per cow per day. It will obviously vary on the size of the herd, the methods are being used, feeds that's being used, obviously. But I think as a rule of thumb, anywhere between 25 and 40 cents per cow per day. That's what we estimate. But again, that will vary quite a lot depending on the farm. Obviously, by now, I managed to explain why near-infrared based tool is, and specifically the SCIO cup, is good for for testing dry matter on dairy farm. But just to give you an idea, the scan takes about 10 seconds versus other methods that can take hours. It's very easy to use. There's less room for operator error. Specifically when you're drying down material, specifically forage, that's prone to mistakes that are very difficult to notice, because you can have a little bit of the material drop down after you dry down. You can have the material burned. There's so many different ways. And not saying, I mean, people are very proficient in the way they're using caster ovens today and dehydrator and can really get good performance, but that will take some more, attention and experience from whoever is operating this. And of course, eventually it's a non-destructive method, the SCIO cup, so it allows you to analyze more and more samples. There's something very important about the SCIO cup. It allows to analyze a relatively large sample, which is not been the case in many other near-infrared systems in the past. And I think that's very important, because you really want to average the sample as much as you can and not take a very small, non-representative part of the material. Two or three last slides. So I've talked a lot until now about how this technology can be used to analyze forage on farm and the value that it can bring. Not many people really know how it works. And, perhaps it's not even interesting to many people how exactly that works. But, we're already here. I thought it will be interesting for people to also understand a little bit about the technology behind this. So as I mentioned initially, SCIO cup is using what is known as near-infrared spectroscopy, many times being abbreviated by NIR or NIRS. S would stand for spectroscopy. So essentially, it's using light, but just invisible. It's infrared, so it's invisible to us, but it's light, to analyze materials. We will have a light source on the device that will illuminate the sample. The light will go with some, interaction with the forage or the material. Some of the light will be absorbed, and the rest of the light will be reflected back to our sensor, the spectrometer. And we analyze the spectrum of the light. And then, obviously, the spectrum that's been absorbed is a little bit different than the light that illuminates the sample, because some of it will be absorbed. And then we can analyze that. And by analyzing that spectrum, we get information about the chemical composition of the material that we're testing. And that's how we know, to analyze material. There's a difference between forage with a lot of water or moisture than a forage that's very dry. They'll have different spectra. And that's how we can get that type of information. However, it's not that simple. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of work needs to be done in order to analyze or to be able to get the information we want for a specific material. And that's where we create what we call calibrations. We basically teach our systems how to analyze a specific material for a specific parameter. So this slide basically explains that process. So it's not like, usually in a more intuitive way, you see a certain feature in the spectrum and you say, hey, that means more or less moisture. But in case of near-infrared spectroscopy, we don't do this just like that. We use machine learning to actually teach our systems how to analyze a certain material. It's very much like, today everyone speaks about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how computers can now learn how to speak or how to talk to us. So it's a very similar process, just with a different type of application. But anyway, the way we do it, we will collect a lot of samples that represent what we expect to see in reality. We'll scan them with the SCIO cup and then send the sample to a laboratory that we trust for analysis. We'll take all that data and use machine learning algorithms to create a model, also known as calibration. So we call it models, but a lot of people will call it calibrations. And then that calibration or model is being then deployed in our cloud system. And then next time you take a scan with a sample of forage, it will go through the mobile phone to the cloud, it will run through the model, and the model basically knows how to receive a scan or a spectrum and then output, the analysis result, in this case, dry matter for forage. So just so you know, that's why we can always improve, because we can add more data to our models, we can improve the algorithms that we use. For example, this year, we expect to add what is known as deep learning into our system. So far, we've had conventional, so to speak, machine learning. We will be adding this kind of a deep learning models to our system to further improve the service that we provide. Finally, obviously, we'll open the session now for questions, but if you have questions later on, please always feel free to send an email to support@consumerphysics.com. We're happy to answer any questions you guys have. And also, we work with DFA in the US to bring this kind of technology and solutions to farmers and nutritionists. So in case you are in contact with DFA people, representatives throughout the country, please feel free to contact them as well and ask any questions you may have. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. Guess I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Damian. Yep, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I don't see any yet, but I've got a couple. First, I was wondering if you could speak for a minute about if sample temperature or the environment that you're using the SCIO cup, the temperature of the environment, if you're bringing it out to your bunk when it's 10 below, is that going to change your results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, we train our system or create the calibrations to support a relatively wide range of temperatures, whether it is in this case, I'm referring to the sample temperature. The environment or the ambient temperature is also important. But either way, the sample temperature has to be above the freezing point. So, and I know that, in most cases, even if the, outside you're below freezing temperature, the sample may still be above. Usually the piles or the bunkers, the silage, it's enough to just put your hand inside or already be, collecting a sample that's not frozen. But if the sample is frozen, that will generate a huge, change in the way the system reads it. So you need to make sure the sample is not frozen. But that usually isn't a big issue for forage. Then from an ambient temperature and using the cup at a certain temperature, then again it should be okay to use it in room temperature and even in cold temperature. But if you go way below less than 20 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit, then I'd recommend just taking the sample somewhere, inside a room and just measure it with a higher temperature. So anything above 30 should be fine. Sometimes even a little bit below for the ambient temperature, not for the sample itself. But in these cases where it's very cold outside, it's probably better just to bring the sample in and take a measurement inside.
Perfect, thanks. And you spoke a little bit about sampling out in the field when we're getting ready to harvest. Are there some restrictions on particle size when you're doing that? Like, I guess for your hay crops, it's a little bit different than your corn crop. What's the best way to get a good sample that you're going to use that information to determine if you're going to chop today or wait?
So ideally, if you can chop the sample, that's the best. Definitely in corn silage, you must use a chopped sample. In haylage, that will vary, and in haylage, generally speaking, it's a bit more tricky because you'd just cut it and then let it stay in the field a little bit. I know that's been tricky a little bit for people using the SCIO cup, and you should try as much as you can to cut the sample when you put it inside the cup. And again, corn silage, you must chop it in order to get a good result. Um, but other than that, you should be all set up. I mean, if it goes inside the cup and it covers the dome that's inside the glass dome inside the cup, it should be fine. Again, our recommendation as much as possible is to chop it. It doesn't matter so much if you chop it to a certain, for 1 inch, half an inch and a half. That doesn't matter too much. But if you just put it as a whole, that may generate some differences.
Gotcha. Could you speak for a minute about setting this up on the farm? You need to create like a username and a password. Can you talk a little bit about the economics, the costs associated with the unit and the subscription and how that all plays into everything?
Sure. So first of all, in terms of onboarding, so once you get a SCIO cup and you get the unit, we will make sure, our team will also send you an email with onboarding instructions, which will include, a username. So the username is usually an email address that we will ask the customer to provide us with. And then for that email address, we'll create a password, and then you can download the app and just log in, and the app will take you through what you need to do. But we also send in the email onboarding material, so like a quick start guide that will guide you through the different steps you need to make, and short video. There's a lot of ways to receive the information of how to use the device in the farm. Still, if that's not enough and you still have questions, again, please contact support@consumerphysics.com, or a DFA member or someone from the DFA farm supplies to assist you with this. From an economic standpoint, so the way we work is there's an initial cost for the SCIO cup itself, and then there's a yearly subscription that we charge, for the overall service. So again, there will be, today, it's about $2,000 or so for the hardware itself, and then $1,200 per year for the service. That's for the forage package. If someone actually wants the grain package, we can make a bundle of those two packages, or there's a price for the grain package separately. But usually most of the people in dairy farms are interested in the forage package. So that's $1,200 per year. And there are some different offers that exist from DFA, including what we have now. We have a promotion, I believe, that was presented in the DFA meeting last week, that if you buy for 3 years license, you get a 6 months, extra 6 months for free. So please, I'm sure everything is on, either the website, or if you contact your DFA rep, you'll be able to get it. And again, if you contact us, we'll also be providing you with this offer. And then once a year, or after the license expires, we will send you an email, reminding you that you need to renew the license. And there's either you do it via DFA if you're working with DFA, or via our online shop. You can easily just renew the license, and that's it.
So in your opinion, I was looking at your ROI calculator. Is there like a break-even herd size for using the SCIO cup? Or, I can see how there's a benefit no matter what size you are, but do you think that there's an actual herd size where it really is a good return?
So for sure, the larger the herd size, the better is the return. There's no doubt about that. And I understand also the fact that if you have a much smaller herd size, you have less people to handle more things. So it's clear that a much larger farm can afford things that a much smaller farm cannot afford. And I can see how if you have a 50 cows or 100 cows in your herd, it will be more difficult. I'd still recommend it, by the way, if you track dry matter and if you're going to be adjusting your rations. But if even if that's a too difficult task to do sometimes, then I understand why this can be difficult for a much smaller farm. But any farm above 300 cows or so, I think that makes total sense. I even think it makes sense to smaller farms, but I can understand why it can be more difficult there. But 300 or so cows, in my opinion, that's the threshold.
Perfect. And the only other question I had was if you could speak for a minute, is the dome, since it uses light, my understanding is that you need to keep it covered and in the case to protect it from damage from the light. Is that true, or is it?
So that brings up two questions actually. So first of all, when you're using the cup, you need to fill the cup with forage to make sure that it's properly analyzed. So have enough material within the cup. If you do that, you're all good. We recommend using the lid to close it, but if you're not under direct sunlight illumination, that's fine if you're not using the lid. But again, we do recommend using the black lid to cover the cup when you're using it. Now, in addition to this, every SCIO cup comes with this nice case where it can be stored. Or if you're going to be taking the cup from one place to the other, or just putting it in the car or in storage, please use the case to store the cup. That's going to help protect the cup from being broken or something like that by mistake. So it's a very good point.
Perfect. Well, I still don't see any questions in the chat, Damian, but if any come along, we will send them your way. You're getting off pretty easy today. I'm going to share my screen with the QR codes for the credits, I think. There it is. And there's a couple polls here. Otherwise, we're all set. Damian, thank you so much for joining us today. And
Thank
we'll
you.
wrap up a little early here.
All right. That's great. And yeah, thank you very much for hosting us.
Not a problem. It was a great presentation. We appreciate it.
All right. All right, everyone. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Oops.